This is Carlisle Castle, and when I was a little boy I was completely obsessed by it. Its architecture was massive, unbelievably massive and solid, and it was a castle with a magnificently warlike history. It was attacked by full-blown Scottish armies on loads of occasions. Kings and queens came here. There were daring escapes. So what little Grundy wouldn't be enthralled by all of those marvellously romantic associations which left their mark on the building. This is a prison cell which is used for, actually I don't know how long it's been used for, but it was certainly used in 1746 when Major MacDonald of Kippock, who was one of Bonnie Prince Charlie's men, was taken from here to be executed. But it must have been in use for hundreds of years before that, because this graffiti, which is laboriously scratched on the only parts of the room to receive direct light, is a mass of thrilling 13th and 14th century images. I made that little piece of film a couple of years ago when I was a younger, and I like to think a less substantial man than I am nowadays. 2 years in an almost totally bacon sandwich-free environment have left me half the man that I used to be. I would quite like to check that out. I rest my case. I have become a sylph. Who needs bacon sandwiches anyway? Carlisle was a working castle. It was built by the Normans when they were trying to tame this bit of England, and it stayed important because it was close to the border. It's only 9 miles up north to Scotland, so Carlisle was built to guard the first major river crossing on the English side of the border. It was besieged by full Scottish armies on at least 9 occasions, in 1296 and 1297. In 1311, Robert the Bruce, 1380, I don't know, loads of times. Sometimes they won, sometimes they didn't, but they were always made to work for the advantage by the massive solidity of the place. As a result, it's not, as castles go, a particularly beautiful or romantic looking one. It's solid and squat and plain, it's dour and workmanlike, not unlike myself, some might say. But however much I love it, and I do love it, because of its extraordinary history and because of the charm of childhood associations, I couldn't say in all honesty that it's got particularly glorious features or lofty battlements. Unlike this one. This is Dunstanburgh Castle on the Northumberland coast, which is awash with the very things that Carlisle lacks. This is captivating architecture, towers and assorted, splendid, sticky-uppy bits. This gatehouse, for example, which was built early in the 14th century, was obviously the way into the castle, traditionally the most vulnerable and the most dangerous part of any castle, and of course it needed to be immensely strong, just like at Carlisle. The defences start with a couple of holes above the archway there. They're called murder holes because you could pour nasty stuff down on the heads of anybody who was approaching the gateway, and apparently the stuff was absolute murder to get off your clothes. I think that was the origin of the name. Then there's the stone-vaulted passageway protected by guard chambers on both sides, and this is the groove where the portcullis came down. So this was very, very strong, but this gatehouse wasn't just a source of strength, because it doubled as the house of the castle governor, so it's also been made into a magnificent piece of showy-offy architecture. It looked splendid from outside, and inside there were fine chambers and great halls and all that sort of thing, all of the trappings of a great house. Of course, Dunstanburgh had a job to do as well, just like Carlisle. It had 2 jobs, in fact. It had to stop the Scots coming down the east coast plain over there, but it also had to stop them coming down the other great road into England, the sea road. There was a harbour here in the Middle Ages, and Dunstanburgh would have had the responsibility of intercepting rogue ships sneaking down the coast. And it had a third job, actually, because it wasn't just a defensive building to protect England, it was a weapon as well, a launching pad for attacks on Scotland. Apparently, on one occasion, the whole English fleet managed to anchor here in preparation for an invasion. So this castle is rich in history and architecture, but that's not really why we come to it nowadays. We come because it oozes beauty and romance. The coast is glorious, the ruins are hugely atmospheric. I came up here once leading a party of overseas visitors, and as we approached the castle, it started to snow. Horizontal snow, straight off the hills and right into our ears. It was bitterly cold. Did I mention that this was in June? I think it was the 16th of June, if my memory serves me right. Do you know, my overseas visitors loved it. They were stupid, of course, but they just couldn't get over the atmosphere of this wild place and the fantastic romance of the ruins. That's what we expect of castles, isn't it? We revere them for their mellow beauties and their romantic associations. We love to visit them to get our souls stirred, which is very lucky for those of us in the north who like a bit of soul stirring, because we've got loads of them. Loads and loads of them, as we say in Newcastle. One of the most remarkable things about the castles of the north is what an astonishing variety of different types there are. So far we've focused on a couple of standard full-blown castles with gatehouses and curtain walls and all of the trimmings. But there are lots of other types as well. Belsay in Northumberland, for example, is a tower house which contains in one single super tower all of the accommodation that you needed in a medieval house. It's got a kitchen and a great hall, there's a great chamber up above, and in the turrets all around there are chapels and bedrooms, stuff like that. So, a complete house, but with everything sort of scrunched up into one single defendable tower. I mean, that is superb, isn't it? I like to get around. I've been in Cumberland so far, and Northumberland, and here I am in North Yorkshire, at Bolton Castle to be precise. Well, actually, to be even more precise, I'm in Castle Bolton, because the village is called Castle Bolton and the castle's called Bolton Castle. So really, I'm at Bolton Castle. You probably want me to shut up, don't you? Anyway, here I am at Bolton Castle in Wensleydale, to which I have come because it's a beautiful castle in a beautiful place. And that's as good an excuse as any. Carlisle and Dunstanburgh were both royal castles. Their purpose was clear. They had to do the king's work. They had to provide a base to defend his territories and attack his enemies. But Bolton Castle was different. Bolton was built in the 1370s as a private house by a private family, the Scropes. The Yorkshire Scropes. I can hardly say that without sniggering. It's such a funny name. The Scropes were interested in defending themselves, of course, which is one of the reasons that they built a castle. Even as far from the border as this, there wasn't a lot of security in the 1370s. But this castle clearly had another purpose, and that was to dominate the landscape, to show who had the money and who had the power. This was a powerhouse, literally. The people who lived here owned everything that they could see from their battlements. They had the power of life and death. That's the message of this building, and I'm not sure that it would have been a comforting message to the people who lived round about. This is a magnificent building, and like Carlisle, it is utterly northern. It's an austere, late medieval castle in a wonderful place, but it doesn't have a lot of blissful beauties, and to come into this dark and rough, unrefined medieval courtyard can still give me a bit of a shiver. You get a sense that dark deeds occurred in places like this, and that's part of the romance of castles too. As far as I can tell from my books, there are 83 full-blown castles and another 130-odd substantial tower-type things surviving in the north. They're not evenly distributed, of course. There are scores of castles near the border and in the northeast, and even in Yorkshire, where the wide coastal plain made it relatively easy to attack England. But there aren't many in Lancashire, and that's because the real enemy was up north, those nasty Scottish-type people, and Lancashire was protected from them by the castles of Cumberland, but even more by the Lake District hills, an apparently impenetrable barrier. You would certainly need your Boy Scout fell-walking badge. Robert the Bruce got to Lancashire once, though, the sneaky beast. In 1322 he had a very cunning wheeze, and instead of trying to get south past Carlisle on the main and agreed route over Shap down the M6, he sneaked round West Cumberland instead, crossing the sands of Morecambe Bay, and led a lightning and devastating raid on Lancaster and Preston before sneaking back to Scotland. What a cheat! This is what he attacked so slyly: Lancaster Castle. It's Lancashire's only major castle, but it's a goodie, a real goodie. Amazingly, it's one of the least known castles in England, but it's also one of the most interesting. Partly, of course, because of the old romance factor which I've been harping on about so much. Its profile, as you can see, is terrific. It dominates the skyline of the city in the most wonderful and romantic way. The views of it and the views from it are as good as you could want. It's been altered loads and loads over the years, but it's still hugely castly and very exciting. But Lancaster's also important because it is unique. You leap back in amazement. Unique is not a word that you often hear about things in the north. Commonplace perhaps, or rather ordinary, but not unique. But this one is. This one is unique. It's the only castle in England which is still fulfilling the function for which it was built. And that function was to do with local government and the administration of justice. Most of the great medieval county towns of England had a castle which acted as a seat of justice and administration. Newcastle and York, Carlisle, their castles all started life like that. But Lancaster still does it. Behind those doors I cannot go unless I do something suitably naughty and get arrested, because behind there is still one of Her Majesty's prisons. Lancaster Castle still holds prisoners, as it has done for almost 1,000 years. More prisoners have been executed here than at any other prison except Newgate in London. This is where they were hanged. This is where the public executions took place. Hanging Corner, it's called. A good enough name, I suppose, because that's what it was. Tens of thousands of prisoners were transported from here to a life of hell in Australia and America, and that was only last year. So, short of a stiff sentence, I can't show you the prison, but everything else is on view, the courtrooms and the judges' lodgings and so on. The ancient buildings which fulfilled these functions were all rebuilt in the late 1700s by an excellent but little-known northern architect called Thomas Harrison, a Yorkshireman. He was born in Richmond, but he did most of his work in the northwest, including remodelling the various legal buildings here at Lancaster. Because he was working within the walls of a castle, he chose to use the Gothic style for his new buildings, which was a little bit unusual at the time, and quite unusual for him, because he was normally happier doing classical buildings. But here he clearly enjoyed himself with the Gothic, as you can see in one especially spiffing room. This is the Shire Hall, which he designed in 1788. I believe that we're the very first film crew to have been allowed to film in here, he said, rather smugly, because this is a superb room, much copied in other parts of the country. The woodwork was all done by a famous Lancaster furniture maker and designer called Richard Gillow. It's a courtroom, of course. It's still used regularly to try cases, and in the past it was Lancashire's main courtroom, but it was also the room from which Lancashire was governed. The justices of the peace who sat here along with the Lord Lieutenant of the county didn't just try criminals, they ran the county. They raised taxes and they passed rules about roads and bridges and things. They licensed pubs, all the sort of jobs that county councils do nowadays. And they did it here, in this room. They don't anymore, of course, the county councils elsewhere, but all of the rest, the justice, the courtrooms and the prison, that still takes place here. And Lancaster is the only place in the country where all of that still happens within the walls of a medieval castle. That's what makes it unique. And finally, a surprising number of castles, even mega full-blown ones, have survived as homes right down to the present day. You wouldn't really expect them to be capable of adapting to modern-day family life, and indeed, there nearly always seem to be disadvantages about living in a castle. I interviewed a duchess on the radio once, and I asked her about the difficulties that she encountered living in her castle. And she said that her biggest problem was size. By the time she got from the kitchen to her bedroom, the hot milk was hardly ever as hot as she wanted it to be. Do you know, I felt sorry for her. She didn't live here, that particular duchess, though duchesses did live here once. This is Raby Castle, which was built in the 14th century by the Neville family, which was once one of the most important families in medieval England. There were Nevilles giving birth to kings and getting beheaded and charging around the pages of Shakespeare plays for hundreds of years. Well, now it's the home of Lord Barnard, who's apparently descended from the original Nevilles. His house, Raby, is, as you can see, a fantastic house, still with a real sense of the castle about it. And like most big castles of that period, it was, and in this case it remains, a rough ring of medieval towers surrounding a central courtyard. The towers include the Watchtower, Clifford's Tower, Mount Rascolf, Chapel Tower and Gate, Bulmer's Tower, Jones Tower, Neville Tower and Gateway, including, apparently, marks made by a battering ram. How real is that? Inside, there are plenty more medieval remains, including what is probably the finest 14th century kitchen in England. There were a lot of people in a medieval castle, and they shifted a lot of food. Imagine this place with all of those fireplaces roaring away and gangs of naked male scullions rushing about. You can stop imagining that now, madam. It's true, though. I've read somewhere that these kitchens were so hot that the kitchen workers were often starkers, and they drank loads too, gallons of beer a day. Now, you wouldn't catch people doing that nowadays, would you? But isn't this a wonderful room, high and airy, to allow the heat and smoke from all of these gigantic fireplaces to escape through the roof? So there are plenty of medieval remains, but your dukes and your earls weren't prepared to live in medieval conditions. So over the centuries, they converted their medieval fortress into a superb house. Nowhere more cleverly than here. In the 18th century, the posh carriages used here were too big to turn round in the courtyard, and anyway, your dukes and your earls didn't like getting out in the wet, so the architect came up with a cunning wheeze of creating this lower hall where the carriages could drive right into the house, drop off the passengers and drive out into the night again, leaving them nice and secure and dry in this exciting and beautiful room. Now that is a good idea. I think I'll copy it in my terraced house. So there we are then, the north, land of castles, land of many castles, land of an astonishing variety of castles. Aren't we the lucky ones?